Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, colleagues. This is the 5th day of the International Financial Congress organized by the Bank of Russia. Today we're going to hold a panel discussion which is dedicated to bank and non-bank instruments for business financing. We're going to talk about the development prospects in this field. In order to talk about this interesting, multifaceted topic, we have invited very interesting experts joining us online. We have Anna Baginskaya from Bank or Sber. He'll tell us which one is the correct designation. We have Natalia Loginova, Director of the Asia Relations Moscow Exchange. We also have Maxim Volkov from the Investment Development Agency, Stanislav Kolesnichenko, Skolkovo Ventures, and Sergei Sokolov is with us online from Apora, Russia, or Russian non-governmental organization for small and medium business. We're going to split this discussion into two rounds. First, we will try to give an answer to a standard issue. This last year has been difficult. How has it affected the market of financial instruments? And during the second round, we're going to talk about the prospects and the future trends we expect the market to demonstrate, what barriers there are, and which of them we need to overcome. And then we'll try to take stock of the discussion. Should we receive any questions from the audience on our tablet, we'll also try to respond to them. And my name is Mikhail Kovrigin. I work at the Financial Market Strategy Department, Bank of Russia. My first question will go to Anna Baginskaya. What is happening to bank and non-bank funding for projects in Russia? Have we seen a resumption of new projects launches, and what is happening to the PPP? Yes, thank you, Mikhail. First, I would like to tell you that I'm in funding complex deals and transactions in PPP, and I'm going to talk about the issue at hand through this prism. Yes, last year saw a certain drop because certainly the government was focused on addressing the disasters, as it were, metaphorical ones. Of course, there were some urgent tasks to be addressed in SMEs, for instance, so infrastructure tasks were relegated to the background. But this year we see a very serious trend. There is a recovery, there is even growth as compared to pre-pandemic times. Before the pandemic, even though the pandemic has entered into its second year, given the fact that there are big infrastructure needs and capital-intensive long-term projects that have a very complicated structure, and these needs persist and they expand. We need more infrastructure in healthcare. Transport infrastructure is in demand, just as it has ever been, and we still need new projects. The utilities also need a refurbishment of infrastructure. Education and social infrastructure have to be refurbished and modernized. Last year we understood, thanks to the Ministry of Education, that there's going to be a boom of children who are going to go to the first form of school. We do not see any additional sources of funding. Yes, we have the National Welfare Fund, but it's limited, and that is why the emphasis is going to be placed on banking finance. And interestingly, we even have government-run projects that seek to attract government bank investment into long-term projects with a horizon of up to 15 years. The first projects are in the field of education, And in other sectors, there are also going to be new projects. Education has been our pilot project, and many Russian regions are planning new ones. In the next 3 years, we have received more than 200 applications over the last 3 months. Mostly these are projects for establishing primary education facility, but other projects are moving forward as well. We see a demand for that, and our regions are working together with investors. Investors turn to banks in order to attract funding. So, as we can see, the budget is relying on banks and on the money from the banks. And when these projects are implemented, they are supposed to meet the basic banking requirements. These are the banks that put forth these requirements, and if projects want to be successful, if they want to attract this investment, they have to meet these requirements. Another thing, we see that these projects are done in such a way that the budget will bear the risk and the money is going to be returned over the longer horizon. So these are not just short-term funding instruments. Speaking about new instruments, among other things, we see a demand for syndicated loans on, typical yet complex projects. It would seem as a paradox in itself, but still, we see many transactions with a very complex structure, but they can be replicated, such deals. You can replicate it 10 times, 50 times, 200 times. And of course, one single bank cannot provide the necessary funding. So mostly these are syndicated loans, and there needs to be a network of financial institutions. And that is where the issue of models, syndicate, documentation comes into play. So far, we have not yet done it, but I think we're going to do that in the next 6 months or so. And we will come up with model documents that could be used in such transactions with a certain amount of risk, with a certain amount of liquidity, so they will be more or less standardized, more or less uniform. There's another thing. We see concessional transactions in SOP, and this is also the doctrine that the government is trying to introduce. In other words, the government tries to provide the market with an opportunity to use new instruments that were born just some time ago. SOP, that is the Special Organization of Project Financing, that is a new instrument that has just made its way into the civil code. And we will see how the market is going to react and to what extent investors are going to be interested in such new types of tools. I think these are the general current trends that we see. As a financial institution that works in infrastructure, maybe other fields have different trends, but that's what I have to tell you for now. Yes, we are not surprised that banks have a large role to play in funding big, complex projects. My next question goes to Maxim Volkov. You participate together with the central bank on developing a roadmap on accessible finance. To complement what Anna has shared with us, could you share with us the main directions that this roadmap stipulates. Yes, thank you. Colleagues, I would like to say good afternoon to all of you. I'm glad to see all of you, both online and offline. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to the Congress. Yes, we have taken a direct part in elaborating this roadmap. We believe this roadmap is something unique. This roadmap has been adopted simultaneously by the government of Russia and the Bank of Russia, and it represents a consensus on a number of dimensions, because it's dedicated both to instruments and institutions of development for the sake of new investment projects. Notably, this roadmap is a living working document. It can be amended and perfected on a daily, regular basis. When we started this work on the roadmap, we were given thought to where to start from, and we started to communicate with the market, to collect different opinions, and at a certain point of time, this roadmap was born, and there was a huge contribution from the Bank of Russia. I would like to thank Mr. Shvetsov and, of course, the Ministry of Finance and the government took an active part in this process as well. And when the roadmap emerged, we identified two very important trends, post-COVID probably, but they're also important in as much as we need to think how to further develop the financial market and funding instruments. First, there's such a trend as institutionalization of trust. As we have seen, trust is of paramount importance. And right now, there are huge concerns with regard to that, and the roadmap represents that too. First, we are thinking about establishing special courts of arbitration working together with the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs under the PPP, under the concessional agreements, and also under special contracts. You know, this stabilization clause is one of the messages, one of the indispensable elements of trust in the financial market, which we have right now. And, you know, there are such instruments as securitization of future tax revenues and also scoring and ranking, so everything that develops that. Another important thing that helps develop trust is the government obligations under concessional agreements and under the public-private partnership. And there are mechanisms that can compensate any changes that might transpire. When we came up with the roadmap, we didn't think about that, but now that the roadmap is here, now that we're working on it, we understand how important it is right now. There is another trend emerging, and which we see, it would seem trivial, but still I have to point out it. It's digital transformation, and the roadmap takes that into account. It takes into account digital actions and also the issues of establishing a digital legal entity when the legal entity is established at a certain point of time without having a physical address, and everything is happening online. And of course there are some utilitarian digital rights. We believe this is a whole new direction in investment. Basically, you have debt, you also have equity, and we've always advocated increasing investment into equity, because equity is something Russia is currently lacking. Yes, the banking system is well advanced, and we rely on it in many respects, and that is the right thing to do. The government has done a lot in order to make sure that banking system and state-run banks, top 30 banks, should have a comfortable environment and get all kinds of support and have all the opportunities to enter in the market. And this infrastructure is something we need to seize, to use in order to develop investment into equity. Now, getting back to utilitarian digital rights, we believe it is a promising avenue which allows for investment into future production capacities. Say there is a project that has no production capacities. It wants to launch this production facilities, but to do that, it has to sell the future digital rights. And then it'll have money to invest into production capacities. We're working together with the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Russia, and we will work on that and develop this instrument, in particular as part of the agreement on promotion and protection of investment. I think that's almost everything I wanted to say as far as trends are concerned. So, new instruments and also digitalization, something that needs a special toolkit of its own. Yes, thank you. Right now, let's give the floor to Natalia Loginova from the point of view of stock exchange. Natalia, how do you think the market of securities has responded to this pandemic year? It has been difficult. Right now, it's 2021. What do you think about the prospects for the development of the securities market henceforth? Thank you very much, Mikhail. I think it's common knowledge that the pandemic has brought about significant difficulties. The Russian economy, the global economy have suffered despite these difficulties. As far as the Russian public market is concerned, 2020 was a record year in terms of the number of new private investors. Last year, we had more than 4 million new retail investors coming into the market as compared to 1.5 million of new investors that we saw flock to the market back in 2019. There are many driving forces that explain this phenomenon. To an extent, the stock exchange simply benefited from lockdowns and isolation because it was impossible to spend money on restaurants, on shopping, on travels, and naturally this money started to flow into the stock exchange, into the investment market. You know, the infrastructure was there, broker companies created convenient interface. It allowed people to set up investment accounts without any difficulties, and it also allowed people to just start trading in the market. And we also had very low deposit rates. Last year they were at a record low as far as the Russian economy is concerned. There was an overall uncertainty that the pandemic has brought to everyone, and it pushed people into the securities. It had a very positive impact on the stock exchange dynamics. Last year, the index of the Moscow Stock Exchange grew. Right now, we have more than 12 million private investors in the market. And among the developing economies, we are one of the top economies in terms of individuals' participation in the shares market. Given the current dynamics, the potential of this market, the potential for finding businesses through these stock exchange instruments are very big. Last year there were 3 important IPOs in the market, and right now there is a growing interest in public placement. But in order for the stock exchange to develop successfully, we need a greater role of institutional investors, long money, as it were. We need more collective investment too. Yes, it's true. 2021 saw that after hitting rock bottom, the interest rates bounced back and started to grow. So probably this driving factor for the stock exchange is no longer valid, but still there is a growing demand for new issuance, and also the Russian investors are interested in buying shares and securities as far as debt instruments are concerned. Last year we saw an increase of up to 20% in terms of volume and turnover. This year, against the backdrop of growing key rate, we see a slowdown in that process year on year. Judging by the first 6 months, the volume dropped a little in terms of new bonds issuance. But, you know, it's very interesting, it's very curious, and I like to comment on that. There was a study conducted by the Bank of Russia in 2020. it sought to explain why industrial companies were not investing. I mean, investing in capital. 47% of respondents pointed to high costs of borrowing. And we've always and long seen correlation between investment into capital and the dynamics of real interest rates. Once real interest rates go down or go into the negative, investment in capital grow and grow significantly, whereas if the obverse is true, then the investment into capital goes down. There's another important factor that explains why industrial companies are not investing into capital. There are some strict requirements with regard to the collateral and also insufficient volume and also the maturity period of borrowings. And this is where new instruments come into play, because usually bonds do not require a collateral, and we see every year new companies emerge into the market. Overall, our bond market has 450 issuers, and every year we have another 50 companies or so, and they flock into different sectors, and there are big issuers too. There are small and medium enterprises. There are companies that are growing very dynamically. So in spite of a certain slowdown of the bond market in 2020, we still see a very big prospect for its development in the future. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Natalia. Yes, we have big business, super big business, and also medium business. I would like to ask this question of Sergei Sokolov. You know how SMEs work, how they operate. I would like to ask you to give your assessment to the current state of affairs in SMEs. Do SMEs feel support? What do you think about access to funding? What can you tell us about that? Yes. Good afternoon. Yes, colleagues. SMEs have specific requirements, specific needs. The borrower profile in SMEs is very specific, and last year, of course, had an impact on access to funding. Yes, there was a notion that emerged, the sectors that were hit hardest, around 13, but as a matter of fact, the number of such industries that were hit very hard is far greater, far bigger. And if there were small and medium enterprises that had a credit line, albeit small ones, they still faced a very in-depth analysis of their activities based through the banks. And if there were some covenants that were not observed, banks simply tightened the terms of cooperation. Sometimes they even shut down funding entirely. And this is the situation that we faced last year. And some government authorities in Siberia and other regions responded urgently. They topped up regional funding structures in order to bridge those cash gaps, providing easily accessible regional resources. But unfortunately, not everyone managed to stay afloat. Yes, it's true that the government has introduced a number of institutions that support small and medium enterprises. They either support or they help provide guarantees. Sometimes they give guarantees, and sometimes they support the collateral. Usually, banks cite the instructions from the central bank. They say that the money of the deposit holders is sacrosanct. Maybe to an extent they're right. Let's take a small entrepreneur, and when this entrepreneur loses funding, he or she, they simply have to take out a consumer loan, assuming full responsibility, and usually the interest rates are higher, up to 15% or even more than that. But this money also is funneled into entrepreneurial activity. And it also creates the problem of arrears in payment. And in Siberia, this problem is quite acute with regard to consumer loans too. But these are just consumer money, consumer loans in words only, because they're used for entrepreneurship.
Thank you. And now we have a question for Stanislav. Since it's an international congress, what could be more international than venture finance? Stanislav, tell us, how did venture financing adapt to the pandemic, and how are we recovering from the pandemic in Russia and globally? If there's something you want to note specifically? Hi, I'm Stanislav Kolesnichenko, Managing Director, Skolkovo Ventures. We focus on innovation and venture capital. I will try to structure my speech to make it relevant and interesting, because everyone thinks that venture market is small, innovative, and far, far away, but some high-tech US companies have achieved capitalization that's above the entire Russian financial market in volume. And high-tech market benefited from the pandemic. This is probably what we all witness firsthand, since all of our audience is online and how the speakers are. And we're using the ICT and cloud solutions that are booming. If you look at how NASDAQ grew in 2020, it was overwhelming. And we saw that the venture market in total grew twofold globally. Look at IPO market, it was skyrocketing. Last year it amounted to over 40 billion. And if we can think of 2-3 large deals in Russia that entered stock exchange and NASDAQ, in the US we can talk hundreds of companies.
Наверное, то, что приобрело, наверное, особую значимость, то, что, наверное, тех инструментов, которые в России нету на публичном рынке, да,
what was very significant and what is virtually obsolete from the Russian market is Spark. We can talk about reasons, but that became a very convenient tool for prompt IPOs that allowed companies to use the window of opportunities. About 300 initial placements were done using SPAC globally last year, which is a lot. Now, moving on to the situation in Russia, unfortunately, the Russian venture market is hard to characterize because there are different reports, there are different ratings that sometimes contradict one another, but unfortunately we haven't grown much. Although the global venture market grew twofold, we haven't. That's a big problem for Russia, since we have a large problem with IPOs, and thus there are few large investors. Globally speaking, about 80% of placements would be M&A, merger and acquisition, which falls outside the scope of this discussion. 20% would be IPO, public placement. Unfortunately, today we see certain major IPOs taking place where book runners do that. We can think of Headhunter, Mail.ru. But then there are small and medium-sized enterprises, and for them, unfortunately, it's difficult to go public. Unlike the US colleagues, they face conservative approach of the regulator. And today we see that very many Russian brokers are starting to provide new services, access to secondaries market, because the market wants to invest to companies prior to their IPO, and brokers are starting to respond to this demand using foreign tools, which is a shame, and I hope, or I'd wish, we had in Russia this toolkit that would allow to do placement for small and medium-sized companies, because demand is there clearly. There's a skyrocketing number of private investors, and high-tech sectors is one of the fastest growing in terms of capital. We just got a question to you from the audience. Is it the problem with the lack of demand for innovation or just lack of breakthrough ideas? Well, I'd say, judging by what we saw in the past year or two, it really goes bottom up, and private investors that have experienced actual growth of their portfolios invested in the US tech sector. I think they've seen that it is possible to do venture investment in Russia at early stages. And in the past year or two, we've seen skyrocketing growth of business angel investments in Russian tech companies. So we anticipate. Oh, and trust me, as this boom began, talented teams started offering interesting and mature ideas to the market. So there used to be a deficit of high-quality projects and products on the market. Now this is changing. We see more and more high-quality products that are targeting not just Russian, but international markets, markets of the US, China, Gulf countries. So they're going international, early stages. The big question, whether M&As and public offerings will happen, we're yet to see. But Russian companies are getting more interested in the high-tech sector. We have colleagues from Sberbank. They don't call themselves Sberbank any longer. They stress that they are a high-tech company rather than a bank. And as far as I understand, there's a big debate going on of whether it's going to be a bank in the future, or future analog of Amazon with all the financial services. But we have this sentiment that our conservative business understands that you cannot win global competition without technology. Thank you for these comments. I think we are all on the same page, and that the difficult phase of the pandemic has pushed us all towards dealing with problems that are long overdue, because many of the issues we've identified have been limiting the development of non-bank instruments for a while, and now we see a window of opportunity to give a push to the development. Let us now do another round and talk about something more specific. What would you think are the most important measures or barriers, or steps needed in the areas where you're experts to achieve, well, if not a breakthrough, then at least some tangible results? Let me start with Anna once again.
Название сессии, там некий такой заложен нерв, что типа банк либо не банковское финансирование. В моем понимании
the title of this session goes bank versus non-bank instrument. So, what type of products, what type of instruments are more promising in your view? And is it likely that banks will actively develop non-bank instruments? Thank you for this question, and this is the ultimate goal at the moment. The state is trying to attract bank finance for all the projects at regional and federal level, although in the past there was a lot of competition between fiscal funding and banking funding. And fiscal funding always came first, and non-fiscal would come second only in rare instances where there was lack of public funding, and you immediately had to deal with the problem. Now the trend has changed. And non-public funding is becoming a priority. We're very likely to see more transactions. As first transactions take place on the market, when first syndicates are created, all major player gets all information about those transactions because the market is following, the market anticipates those transactions, and also regions are becoming more and more competent in attracting lending, limited regress, syndicated loans. So the situation for regions is rather difficult at this moment because they don't have the experience, and the experience they've been accumulating is very important. So if they make it, if they're able to fight their fear, we're likely to see broader use of non-bank instruments. My next question goes to Natalia Loginova. Natalia, if we talk about psychology, what barriers are there, if any? Are issuers afraid to do an IPO, to go on stock exchange? Do you have a recipe? How to fix it? Thank you, Mikhail. I would say that we don't see a lot of fear towards public market instruments. I'd say we did see few IPOs lately, but it's true that sanctions had very negative impact on our financial market. We had very few IPOs since 2014, and only now is the market getting back. Capacity of the market, the share of foreign investors, and this indicator has direct impact. Assessment of businesses that do an IPO went down dramatically. To understand the concept, if you look at free floaters, about 3/4 of Russian-traded companies are institutional foreign investors. Therefore, to develop our market, it's good. We see more collective investors and collective management companies, but we need to develop this industry to encourage the development of the public market, because any issuer asks the first question, how is the public market going to assess me? And if access of foreign investors is limited for whatever reason, we can only count on domestic investors, and Russian investors at this point of time don't define price of assets. Either they follow suit the price that was established by NASDAQ and other big stock exchanges. And secondly, our market for a very long time was exceptionally profitable. Deposits were exceptionally profitable, two-digit profitable, which was unprecedented. And now that rates went to low single digits, we could see stock exchange developing and growing demand of investors. So to answer your question, Mikhail, about psychology, indeed, going public entails large number of obligations in terms of disclosure and corporate governance. Therefore, IPO seems an acceptable financing instrument for larger companies in most cases. That said, there are normally junior platforms. Every large stock exchange of a large country button usually has a junior platform where SMEs could do their placement and get certain benefits, and investors, as they invest in shares of such companies, could get tax deductions or other stimuli. And this is what we need to work on. This is what we've been doing in the stock exchange. And I hope we will be able to set up such platform in Russia as well. And also, public support is needed as stimulus measures. So, there are psychological barriers, but it would be a mistake to say that companies are not active. In the year 2020, we had 3 IPOs and 4 SPOs. 7 major Russian companies returned from international listing platforms to Russia because they see that domestic growth is growing really rapidly. We have 2 IPOs, 7 SPOs with a large pipeline, well, large as compared to previous years, that is, which is good. But there's a flip side. Naturally, inflation risk, slow recovery of consumer demand, production of real income. All of that has an impact, but bottom line is investors are becoming more active, and that encourages more demand of issuers who are likely to see small, medium-sized and large companies going public. Because there's a spiral, the more demand, the more issuers. So one more question, Natalia. What about this junior platform? Should all investors be eligible to participate, only qualified investors that have the expertise? Well, it all depends on standards that will be set by regulators. Regulating access to investors will depend on the quality of disclosure, audit, whatever. There are different ways to control quality of issuers. Well, qualification, well, there will be preconditions, there will be pre-selection. My next question goes to Sergey Sokolov. As far as I understand, you have very fresh experience of going public with an ambition. If you had a genie to ask for a wish, would you ask to change something? Or is it going smoothly? Does it only require fine-tuning? Well, I don't think we have to escalate it up to a genie. But we decided, I work in agriculture, by the way. Our company is large. When we started preparing issuing bonds 2 years ago, we were still an SME, borderline between SME and large business. So we took into account Bank of Russia's support for non-bank funding, and Bank of Russia does awareness raising very actively, so we decided to give it a go. So we issued a small bond, about the total amount, 70 million rubles, just as a test launch. And we've experienced all the problems that everyone has in mind when considering costs related to the process. We've seen that infrastructure we need was basically lacking, infrastructure that would help prepare an application, interacting with stock exchange, the bank, honoring accounting requirements, etc., etc. So in Novosibirsk, there's just one company that provides such services, and when there's a monopoly, you cannot negotiate terms. So we've looked at all costs, and I can give you over a 3-year period 48 payments. That gives us from about 6 million out of 70. 6 million are the costs related to issuance, sales of bonds, although our agribusiness sector is growing fast. But although we sold quickly, we still had to pay those huge costs. So I wish I would have, for the Bank of Russia rather, to motivate such experts, maybe create some sort of support using my business centers that exist in every region of Russia. There should be competition, otherwise costs are high. Also, as of this year, you need to verify your credit rating and the average market offer. We've looked beyond Siberia because we understand we have restrictions, so we looked at Moscow. The average would be 800,000 rubles per annum, which is a lot of money for an SME. And I don't think they do that much of an analysis, since we're talking about an SME, there isn't that much data to look at. So if you do an issuance of for 3 years, that adds 2.4 million of costs. So that's a lot of money. So indeed, 3 years is a long maturity. Banks hardly ever give you that long loans these days. For SMEs today, those costs can be partially covered with subsidies of the Ministry of Trade of Russia. Our effective rate, taking into account the little helpers that helped us, was 14.5%. And net bond payments were 11.5%, since it was our first issue. But the Bank of Russia, the Ministry of Industrial Development, is subsidizing certain costs, like 1%, which is still a lot. Thank you, Sergey. I understand the situation is difficult, so point taken. We don't have much time. I have a question to Maxim Volkov, a question from the audience. Spikes 2.0. I mean, does the regulation change too rapidly? Does that limit institutional development? Thank you for this very good question. We oftentimes joke about all the peaks and spikes and all the acronyms. But what's behind them are various support measures, region-related, dependent on contract types. And they're not changing. They are improving, they're augmenting. And sometimes, I would agree, investors get confused. There can be misunderstanding, but we're creating a GIS system. It's an electronic system that would provide information on map about different measures of support that exist in different regions that would be easy to navigate for investors, would contain the comprehensive information. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, experts. I think we were able to dive into this complicated subject, but lots remains to be done. I wish you every success. in your work.
Спасибо большое.
Stay well and enjoy the weekend. Thank you. Goodbye.
Добрый день, дорогие друзья.
Good afternoon, dear friends. We begin our strategic session on lifting the corporate veil and redrawing the limits of responsibility. Who is the real winner? First, allow me to introduce to you the participants of our today's discussion. Alexei Kuznov, Director of the Legal Department, Bank of Russia. Ilya Polyakov, Chairman of the Management Board, Rosbank. Yuri Isayev, Director General of the State Corporation Deposit Insurance Agency, and Alexander Sokolov, President and Chairman of the Management Board, Trust Bank. Indeed, starting from July 2021, credit organizations, insurance companies, pension funds have to submit to the Bank of Russia information on their controlling parties and the regulator has to identify financial institutions' ultimate beneficiaries, and it has to place that information on its website, and this seeks to lift the corporate veil. The new law will allow to identify ultimate beneficiaries and also find who really controls this or that company to ensure subsidiary responsibility. This idea is not something absolutely novel, but this law is the next evolutionary step in that regard, and it helps the participants of the financial market to reach a new level of responsibility. And of course, for everyone and for controlling parties, the law introduces several new criteria, several new responsibilities. But before we move on to a Q&A session, I would like to propose that everyone who has joined us should participate in a poll. Could you please put it on the screen? Will the law allow reaching the goal envisioned by the legislator? And we will take stock of the outcome after the first round of questions and answers, and you can see the question both in Russian and in English. Don't be shy. Give your answer to this question, and there are several choices you can make. Yes, no, I'm not sure, I cannot answer this question. Now, let's move on to the discussion. My first question will go to Alexei Kuznov. Mr. Kuznov, what do you think? What are the most important novelties brought about by the law, and how far, to what extent, will they allow to improve the procedure for holding the controlling parties accountable? And I would like to remind you that we can provide you with up to 5 minutes to give an answer to the question we ask. Yes, thank you very much, friends. You are absolutely right. This is not something novel, even here at the IFC. This question was discussed on several occasions. But, you know, the legislation has been evolving, and we have to place the law into the context, because for the last 2 decades we've been working on improving the legislation. On the one hand, this legislation has always been trying to identify more accurately the ultimate beneficiaries, the controlling parties that have a bearing on the activities of this or that financial organization. At the same time, we were trying to establish the responsibility, in particular property responsibility, of these controlling parties. The whole legislation of this financial regulations, there is something novel about that, that is the ultimate beneficiary, but we have the same notion in bankruptcy law. Maybe there is a novelty in that, apart from the criteria which we see in the bankruptcy law, the legislator has also suggested using the control and important influence criterion, which goes back to the international financial reporting standards. But the thing is, it has already been used when assessing the risk of borrowers and all that. Information in disclosure, this is not something new either. And even the structure of ownership, the issues of securities, banks, everyone has to disclose that information. Information disclosure is a criterion to get access to the deposit insurance system. There are also requirements with regard to non-government pension funds and some other institutions. There is a novelty in that the Bank of Russia has the power to add additional legal entities to the list based on its own criteria. But this is due to the fact that between a controlling party and a controlling organization that is being controlled, there can be a certain conflict of interest, and overcoming that collision of interest is something that falls now within the remit of the Bank of Russia. This list of controlling parties is public, but there is a procedure for administrative appeal, and it's a procedure that is well known to the banking community, in particular in terms of the financial regulation. When the reputation of this or that person is being assessed, and when there is negative assessment, you can be introduced into a list of those who cannot be nominated for such important positions. So this procedure already exists. And also, apart from the administrative appeal, there is also a court appeal that is possible. And over the recent years, we have seen this practice emerge. Courts also give their own rulings on such cases. That's the first part. And it shows us how we can better identify the ownership of financial organizations. There is another track in developing our legislation. It is related to financial responsibility, liability, and there is a logic behind it too. I remember when bankruptcy legislation was established, there was a reference norm. It was a reference to the principles of civil legislation. It said that a participant of society was not liable for the debts of the legal entity he or she participates in. Right now, it's different. We have a legislation on the rights and responsibilities of controlling parties. We have also reinforced our deposit insurance legislation. I do hope Yuri will have a chance to talk about that in greater detail. Probably there is a new thing. The thing is, the law does not just seek to hold controlling parties liable in terms of subsidiary responsibility, because, it's limited. Such liability only happens when the procedure is almost over. But all institutions introduced by the law seek to ensure property liability when damages are compensated. This court practice is already emerging, both thanks to the efforts of the Bank of Russia and thanks to the efforts of Deposit Insurance Agency. Alexander Sokolov, who is with us, knows that, and we work, and there are several processes that are ongoing, and the approaches have already been elaborated. I believe that the legislation seeks to raise the efficiency of holding people accountable. Because behind these instruments, there is possibility to block very fast the embezzlement or the sale of assets, thanks to special provision measures. But that's what we see on the surface. If you dig deeper, then you'll see that this mechanism seeks to prevent irregular behavior by controlling parties in the financial markets. Thank you very much, Alexei. As a follow-up to what you said, I would like to address my next question to Alexander Sokolov. What do you think, Mr. Sokolov? Do you think it is, it's worthwhile disclosing information and making it public? Do you think this public nature of the list of controlling parties, do you think this disclosure will raise openness, transparency, and allow to better hold people accountable? I think, yes, thank you. I think it's worthwhile, I think it's justified, because we seek to create an honest business environment in our country. If you've got nothing to hide, so what can be the problem with publicly disclosing that, yes, you are a beneficiary of this or that business? What's the problem with the regulator disclosing on its website that apart from the management, there are also beneficiaries of this or that company, be that a legal entity or a physical person? So my question is unequivocally yes. At least this new norm of public disclosure is going to render more difficult for those business agents who are not acting in good faith. The conduct of their activities and businesses. You see, any economic agent that seeks to make money, to make profit, will always try to follow the shortest path, the least expensive path of making money. And if this path is cheaper and easier, provided that you break an ethic codes or some laws, then unfortunately this is always going to be the case. This path is going to be always chosen by these business agents. So my belief is that we have to make illegal business too expensive. It has to be more expensive than the honest path. And then we won't have to use the truncheons of our police and enforcement agencies to make everyone keep in line. I think this is also an instrument that will help us use legal, non-violent means to prevent corruption, to make our businesses honest. And I think we have to go in even further. And this public disclosure in future should apply not just to financial organizations, but to any other organization that works with borrowings, with borrowed money. So this is but a first step, because, yes, this sector is most prepared. It's boasting of the highest level of financial literacy, but I do hope that this practice of disclosing information on ultimate beneficiaries will further expand and cover other sectors too. Yes, thank you, Mr. Sokolov. So if someone doesn't want to live an honest life anywhere, we're not going to make life any easier for them. We are going to create an environment that will make it easier to do honest business, however. So how is market responding to these novelties? I would like to welcome a colleague of mine, Ilya Polyakov. Hi, my question goes to you. What do you think about our market? Do you think it's ready for such openness? Don't you think that there's going to be an opposite reaction after these novelties? You know, as they say, if a new law comes into existence, always ways are found to circumvent it. Don't you think that new schemes will emerge to obscure and obfuscate real beneficiaries? Don't you think that an even more complicated, more opaque corporate veil will emerge? Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you, even though online, not in person. But still, it's a pleasure. Before joining this conference, we talked with Yuri Olegovich about these new approaches in the past, it was impossible. Even now that we both are in a business trip, we managed to join this panel in the course of this year's IFC. In response to your question, I will say that I don't think that this will exacerbate the situation, because there is no way back, as a matter of fact. Right now, we see such a state of affairs that it is all but impossible not to disclose this information on ultimate beneficiaries. This law serves as the last element of creating this openness system. You know, I represent a bank that is part of an international group, and in that capacity I support this road towards greater openness. I believe this legislation gives us a greater level of transparency, and this is also something we wish for our clients, for all the stakeholders, and for our investors. I think this is only natural, moving in this direction. And as has already been pointed out today, this is a follow-up to what we saw done in the past. Probably the most important element of this new law is, Alexei has already provided us with an overview of the most important novelties. He has explained to us what this law is about, but I think there is a very important element. Our regulator right now has the power to take preventive actions, and one of the most interesting novelties is the possibility for the Bank of Russia to act proactively. Say if there is negative capital, and the Bank of Russia gets additional rights to take action, and such a situation, instead of simply waiting for this company to go bankrupt, it is also very important that the legislation provides clearer sets of rules, and we now see rules on establishing these lists of credit organizations. And even if this or that organization runs into difficulties, it will not going to take us a whale of time to find who the controlling party is. So it's all going to be more efficient and more transparent. And I would like to join Mr. Sakharov in saying that I do hope that these rules in future will expand and will also cover not just the financial organizations but also other participants of the market. I do hope that they will apply to other legal entities, which will harmonize even greater our requirements and international and Russian standards. As of now, international standards on disclosing ultimate beneficiaries are stricter, and we try to stick to these standards everywhere in Russia too, but sometimes it creates certain competitive disadvantages to us, because there are other players in the market in Russia that are not sticking to those strict sets of rules in disclosing ultimate beneficiaries. I do hope this law is going to be a precursor of a new practice when such norms will be expanded to apply to everyone, and our clients and society as a whole will stand to benefit from that. Thank you very much. You know, I find myself together with Yuri Olegovich on one panel. Yuri, you have a very rich experience of working with credit organizations, in particular organizations that have gone bankrupt due to the circumstances. So what are the difficulties you're experiencing in that regard? Do you think the new law will help address those problems, those issues that you encounter on a regular basis? Good afternoon, colleagues. Mikhail, thank you very much for providing me this opportunity to speak today, to speak on this theme. I would like to say that this theme is of great importance to the Deposit Insurance Agency, To be honest, we were the first organization in Russia that raised the issue of lifting the corporate veil, the corporate cover. It was in December 2012 during the Intergovernmental Group session on preventing illicit financial operations. And our proposals back then to improve this legislation did not garner any support. We were dubbed extremists, as it were. But this extremism of ours, this radicalism, as it were, is based on our deep knowledge of what is happening in the market. For a very long time, our agency has been working with insurance companies, with banks, with pension funds. Half of these procedures have been completed, others are still ongoing, and we conduct controls and inspections at all these organizations. We try to assess the financial component and all the rest, and unfortunately our inspection reveals that in most cases the main reason for bankruptcy and lack of assets are explained by illicit actions by either ultimate beneficiaries or managers. In 80% of cases, we see a criminal element. There is premeditated bankruptcy, and we also face illicit withdrawal of assets from the country abroad. And over these years, we have managed to establish a well-ramified practice of holding managers and beneficiaries liable and accountable for such bankruptcy. And right now, you know, what is at stake is 2 trillion rubles. There are 470 appeals to the court, and the court rulings will amount to more than 1 trillion rubles, and some of the claims are still being considered. And there are also 740 criminal proceedings that have been brought against, and a large chunk of that is beneficiaries. 220 beneficiaries or managers have been convicted. Last year there were court rulings on 52 court proceedings we've been following, and some people got real sentences. And honestly, the faster we are capable of identifying the controlling parties whose actions led to bankruptcy, the greater the probability is that we will be able to arrest the assets which can be used in order to satisfy the creditors' claims. And I would like to point out that the law that has entered into force has provisions that will raise the efficiency of holding beneficiaries and managers civilly liable. You know, we've spoken about this list compiled by the Bank of Russia, and this status of controlling party with regard to a plaintiff and the case, this is probably the most important part, the onus of evidence that shifts onto us, and collecting evidence on controlling parties is often rendered very difficult. Everyone probably remembers Mr. Pugachev, you know. He never put his signature. He put a stamp saying agreed. And in the letters, the employees couldn't even address that person by his name. So the collection of evidence was very difficult. And there is another thing, that is the asset recovery. Even if there is a positive court ruling, if there is a conviction, that does not always mean that the money is going to get back, because assets can be dispersed across different jurisdictions, they can be obfuscated by the corporate veil, and sometimes it's almost impossible to recover assets in Russia. And as we know, very often The law enforcement simply cannot catch these people. They can leave the country before that.
Most important is how quickly you can impose restrictions, and the new law allows for that. But it's a new piece of legislation, and I'm sure it will help enhance transparency of the market.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо большое, Юрий Олегович. Я вижу, присутствующие, все, кто и виртуально, и реально с нами,
all participants online and offline are united in thinking that it's a good law, should improve the situation. But let us compare notes on one more point. Let us poll our audience.
Давайте покажем результаты проведенного в начале
Or
опроса.
rather, let us check on the results of the poll.
Закон или нет.
So, what's your view? Will the law help or not? Will it help attain the goal
На этот вопрос больше половины,
the legislator? 54% is over half, and said yes.
Большие цифры. Но, коллеги, давайте обратим внимание на то,
Which is
что
many
примерно
people,
треть,
but let us know that about 32%, about a third, have doubts,
склоняются к тому, что не поможет, да? Еще 12%
think that probably not, and 12% are not sure.
Наличие и уверенности в том, что будет
generally
лучше от
people
этого
are
закона, и
hopeful,
наличие некоторого скепсиса определенного, и
but
количество таких
some are
скептиков
skeptical.
тоже приличное.
About
Будем
1/3 of people are
поработать, жизнь
skeptical.
покажет.
Well,
Давайте
let's
еще один вопрос интересный
live and see.
затронем.
Let's touch upon one
Усиление или
more
разделение
interesting
ответственности. И
question
вообще, кому выгодны вот эти вот новые требования?
about
В
liability,
случае наступления
sharing
какого-нибудь
liability,
благоприятного, как его
and
называют,
who's going to
иногда
win?
триггерного события,
Should a trigger event
деятельности
take place?
финансовой организации на контролирующих лиц ложится достаточно серьезная,
Supervisory
скажем так,
bodies
нагрузка. И они могут быть привлечены к субсидиарной ответственности, а их средства могут быть заблокированы. И в этой
Facing a lot of
ситуации особое
responsibility.
значение приобретает
They might
добросовестное
face
раскрытие
subsidiary
информации о контролирующих
responsibility.
лицах.
So, about beneficiaries. So, disclosure of information about beneficiaries becomes important. So, going back to Alexander, I want to ask you a question. What do you think? When identifying a beneficiary, is it possible that an internal conflict would emerge where not all beneficiaries would be prepared to lift the veil? Financial institution naturally will be held liable for complying with existing legislation. But who in particular, on behalf of this financial institution, is entitled to identify a list of beneficiaries, and who should be responsible for providing information about beneficiaries to us, meaning the Bank of Russia? We don't have much time, so please limit your statement to 3 minutes max. Well, as regards potential conflicts, of course there's potential for conflicts. I don't think all economic agents will welcome this new law and will be happy to disclose information about beneficiaries who are likely to face opposition, to see, double veils, triple veils, but who should be held responsible for failing to lift the veil? Well, executive bodies of a legal entity
И в первую очередь, конечно, спрос по факту руководства кредитных организаций.
In the first place, CEOs, top management. In a perfect world, if you think of the evolution of this law, we need to think of
последствия или ответственность за нераскрытие своей возможности контроля.
Implications or failure to disclose information about beneficiaries.
Но и на самих бенефициаров, потому что это должна быть.
That should be not just with top management of a legal entity, but with beneficiaries as well. It should be a two-way street in a sense, because we've seen cases where actual beneficiaries would make
операции, те или иные действия
top management do certain things.
предприятий, которыми они управляют,
Management
иногда даже где-то против воли прям
companies,
заставляют.
like force them. We've seen it.
Сейчас еще раз это бремя ответственности
So
ляжет
today,
на руководство
under
организации.
this new law, top management will be held responsible, but in the future we need to think about information. We need to think of holding responsible not just top management, but also beneficiaries once they are identified.
Система штрафов,
Maybe a system of substantial fines needs to be introduced to make it economically
и для организации,
and justified, to make it really expensive
Ну, на самом деле, да, вопрос был такой немножко
refuse to
подвох,
disclose
потому
both
что,
for
скажем,
companies
если,
and for
да,
beneficiaries.
первое лицо не раскрывает того, кто является реальным
Well, you
хозяином,
understand
то
that
мы, собственно,
when
и не
the
можем
CEO
это
refuses to
делать.
disclose beneficiary, how can we punish the beneficiary? How can we hold him responsible if we have no proof? So CEOs will probably be held responsible, although we understand that beneficiary owner might shuffle CEOs. But we need to start somewhere, so let's start there. Alexei, I have a question for you. This new law recognizes as beneficiary not just someone who controls a company at this point of time, but also those people that controlled it in the previous 3 years. 3 years is a long time, I should say, and a lot of change might happen in how this financial organization works and operates. For instance, because the beneficiary might have changed. So do you think this norm, this novelty is justified? It's not a novelty. The existing bankruptcy legislation, when identifying beneficiaries, it defines this time as 3 years. Someone who was in charge for 3 years is considered to be in control. So the big question is, what are the actual processes happening within this financial organization? How they're assessed, how they're documented. Now already, as we look at whether this or that person can formally be nominated as beneficiary, for instance, it could have helped prevent a negative scenario that led to actual bankruptcy. We'll look at decisions that were taken, and we see how management of a company was organized. And in many cases, we see that there are people that would tell owners, for instance, that this would be a mistake, don't do that, structure management differently, rethink your lending policy. And I don't think those people should be held responsible for anything. They should rather be acclaimed for their professional work. And I want to argue with the previous speaker, who said that CEOs should be held responsible for coming up with a list of beneficiaries. I think there is balance in this decision, because there are mechanisms to overcome conflict of interests between the financial organization and the beneficiary that does not want to be disclosed, because the Bank of Russia has the competence to identify those people and to put them on the list that is published, no matter what the organization provides as a list of beneficiaries. Let's ask Yuri. If a CEO is silent and refuses to disclose beneficiaries, and what if we as the Bank of Russia know or can guess? So this new law allows us to identify beneficiary. But will you be comfortable with this practice? What if we tell you that Mr. Ivanov is the beneficiary owner of this organization? Will it help you in asset recovery, for instance? Well, of course it will. And that would be a very good decision that we'd welcome and endorse. Bank of Russia, as regulator, provides supervision for all areas of financial markets. So giving regulator competence to recognize people as beneficiary owners of legal entities makes a lot of sense. I would say even that this is the only viable option in this situation that genuinely reflects the global best practices, where regulators keep an open or a classified registry of beneficiaries and demands that banks disclose the entire management and ownership structure. And information about nominal beneficiaries should be supplemented by information about beneficial ownership. In the EU, there is a directive aimed at preventing using financial system for money laundering or terrorist funding, and it contains all these norms, including keeping a registry of beneficiary owners. Such registries exist in England, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, certain Baltic states, and Malta. And there are countries that are planning to introduce such registries in the nearest term. Hungary and France. France does not have this registry at the moment, but the regulator already today requires that regulators disclose this information on their website. Great Britain, the financial behavior division of the Bank of England, also keeping track, and if you fail to provide information, you can be held accountable. In Austria, they also have this registry, although it is classified. This registry exists in Australia. I mean, it's an established best practice globally, so I think it's a welcome step. But the big question is what happens if there's a discrepancy between registry and real life. So to sum up, yes, it will make our life easier. And for Russia, where the central bank is a mega regulator, the decision to give him these competences makes a lot of sense. It is a lot of responsibility for us. I mean, we don't want to be mistaken and nominate someone a beneficiary owner when he's not. So let us change the subject. We spoke about regulators, those that collect debts, but I have a question for market participants, Ilya in particular. Do you see a positive side of this regulation? Do you think it might get better to live in plain daylight, not under this corporate veil? Do you see advantages potentially? What do you think? Is there anything good? Not much time again, so please be brief. Well, provided management of the Bank of Russia identifies beneficiary owners correctly, everyone should win, including banks themselves. First, banks will not have a choice. Those that try to conceal or that will fail to disclose all information, they will not be able to compete with transparent banks. And also we'll see certain solidarity that all financial institutions will have, because the reputation of the financial sector will very much depend on the position of each and every bank in particular. And when scandals happen, that hits the banking sector in its entirety and undermines confidence and trust in clients. So the banking sector will win if confidence is built. Of course, there'll be more administrative burden for credit institutions because additional reporting will be required, but taking into account all benefits, I wouldn't say this negative impact is that significant. Thank you. Yeah, we're getting questions from the audience, from people that are watching us online. One of the questions is, why is pre-trial appeal procedure needed? Why is this commission needed? Can you ask it? Well, to protect rights of people, because many decisions are taken on the basis of decision of the committee. And it's based on professional judgment when we identify beneficiaries. Do we anticipate that potential beneficiaries will try to appeal being put on the list? Imagine we put someone on the registry and people try to appeal it and take things to court. Do we expect litigations? Well, we expect separate cases of litigation, but not many of them. So we're talking about establishing a legal fact, not liability. Maybe Yuri or Alexander could answer another question from the audience. From your practice, is that realistic to identify beneficiaries if they're residents of foreign countries? And are there any established mechanisms of cooperation between regulations from different jurisdictions to identify beneficiaries or to check information or evidence that you're getting? We do that on a regular basis, both domestically and abroad. And it's easier to do that abroad, actually, because the court system has established court practice. So it's real, it's operational, it's an instrument that is well established in advanced economies, and we will be able to make it operational. One more question from the audience. Will this law push owners that are already on the last breath to give up their businesses altogether? Is it likely to happen that once this law is put in place, people would just withdraw from business? We haven't seen that many cases where people would give up on their licenses, not on the Russian market, but probably this law will result in a growing number of such cases because competition on the market is growing. In Russia, there are still many banks for the size of our economy, so it might happen, but I don't think we should expect many, rather individual cases. Alexei, you said that back in 2015, you came up with this suggestion, and some said that you were too harsh, and there's a question from the audience. Had this law been adopted earlier, do you think we could avoid problems we encountered, raise efficiency? Should it have been taken? Should it have been adopted earlier? Well, had it been adopted earlier, I'm sure we would be able to deal with many problems in a more efficient way. That's pretty obvious. Well, thank God we're finally there. And a pilot phase, the trial and error will take a couple of years, so of course it would be good if such needed legal instruments could be introduced faster. Well, we're almost out of time. We don't have more than 45 minutes left. So I would like to ask our panelists to very briefly answer the following question. 1/3 of our poll participants have doubt that this law will be useful. What do you think? What is it you would change in this legal instrument? Is there something missing? Is there something that should be different? Should it be amended? No, I wouldn't amend this law. Let us check how it goes. As for legal framework generally, it needs to be amended. State Duma did not pass another piece of legislation that was regulating potential departure from the country for those beneficiaries. Alexander, what would you say? Well, I'd also say let's make it operational and see how it goes. Let us collect feedback and then decide what change is needed, if any. As regards future evolution, like I said, I think we need to consider additional responsibility, financial liability, not criminal, but financial. Because we don't want people to land in jail. Many already have, too many. So, system of fines and liability should evolve. We should make it expensive to break the law. Ilya, do you think the law could be improved? Well, I'd say it's a very good piece of legislation. My only wish is to see it applied in practice as it was designed to. And probably this is what people, the 30% of the audience that answered no, have doubts precisely about that. We need to make sure that the law is applied properly. Back in 2015, you were ahead of everyone with your initiatives. Do you think you could set a new target for us? Or should we wait and see how it goes? Well, I think we should wait and see how it goes. Let's look at how our court system responds. So we probably need time to see how those norms apply in real life. And then we'll see what steps we'll need to take. And I agree with previous speakers that we need a law to limit the ability to leave the country. Don't call me extremist for that, but in conclusion, I want to say that we need that, judging from experience. Well, for obvious reasons, because of the pandemic, no one can leave this country, basically. So, pandemic made up for what legislation failed to achieve, but we probably need to continue working in that direction. We only have 1 minute left, so I want to use this time to thank you, dear colleagues, for finding time to join this discussion. We did not have much time, but I think we were able to cover many very relevant issues. We had very enriching discussion. I want to thank our audience all the time for their attention, for many good questions we received. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to cover all questions that we received. I think you understand the general trend.
не просто так этот закон появился, он был выстрадан,
There was good
в какой-то степени вымучен,
thinking,
достаточно
good
хорошо
rationale
проработан.
behind this law.
Я думаю, мы практически пришли к консенсусу, и
I think we've
действительно
come to
время
a
покажет.
consensus.
Давайте
So time will show.
посмотрим.
Let's
Я думаю,
wait
мы
and see.
двигаемся в
And I
одном
think we're
направлении
going
совсем цивилизованным
in the same direction
миром.
as
Спасибо за
the
ваше внимание.
civilized
Всего доброго,
world.
дорогие.
Thank you for your attention and all the best, dear friends. Thank you. You're a great moderator.
Good afternoon, dear panelists. Our today's panel discussion is dedicated to the prospects of IPO in Russia. I do hope for an interesting discussion over the last years. Oh, I forgot to tell you that my name is Yuri Denisov. I'm head of Moscow Exchange and I moderate our today's session. Recently, we've seen significant amendments to our infrastructure. Right now, we've got the National Depository that has a registry of all investors, the National Clearing Center conducts exchange transactions, and the exchange itself gives a wide range of products. Many of them are traded 17 hours per day, and it has created a convenient, comfortable environment for investors. And the exchange acts as the place for pricing the Russian assets. So we have seen an influx, not just of legal entities, but also individual physical persons. Right now we've got 12.7 thousand physical persons who act as investors. They are actively investing. The Moscow Exchange is a platform for share transactions. We've seen around 15 IPOs and SPOs, and 5 of them were IPOs. Right now there are another 10 transactions for public placement in the pipeline. Let me introduce the speakers to you. We have the major participants of this market. Joining us today, we've got Yelena Ivashentseva, Bank Vostok Capital Partner, Senior Partner. We also have Dmitry Sedov, Co-Head of Goldman Sachs Russia, Vladimir Trakov, Vice President for Finance, AFK System, and Alexei Yakovetsky, Global CEO, VTB Capital. Thank you, colleagues. To begin with, I would like to ask you the following question. The IPO volume was not that big recently. In 2020, it was just 0.003% of GDP, whereas back in the past, it rose up to 1.2%, and the ratio of such companies to the GDP is still very small, and there are big prospects for new IPOs. But why so few Russian IPOs so far? And straight to the follow-up question, what do we need to do in order to increase the number of IPOs? Do we need some additional incentives on IPOs? Do we need some specific funds for that? And what do the participants of the market need to do to achieve that? Do we need to explain the owners the need, the importance of IPO? First, I would like to ask this question of all of our participants. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. First, let me begin by answering your question about the small number of IPOs. First, I would like to say that this number is not that small. We need to provide some context to explain that. You drew a comparison with 2007 because that was a peak, that was the last boom of Russian IPOs, as it were. And that was sort of an end, a wrap-up of a several-year history. Before 2007, there was a previous wave of new companies emerging into the stock exchange, and yes, that was 1.7% of the GDP, and that was the peak figures that we saw back then. And afterwards, there was a period when no one hit the stock exchange. Yes, the number was very small, the windows were shut down, and there were other factors preventing this process. But as a matter of fact, there were not a single company that could do that, because everyone who could have done it had done it in the noughties. Yes, there was potential for that in the 2010s, but not the same volume. Right now, what we're witnessing is another stage of our stock exchange market development. We see a new wave of companies that have emerged over the recent years, that have grown, that have developed over the last decades. These are companies from new sectors, new segments of the economy, and these are new challenges also, and new and traditional sectors and new competitors. So in the last 12 months, we see this surge in the number of IPOs. That is what I think, and I'm confident that this 0.03% of GDP will grow in the next several months and years. Maybe they're going to surpass the figures we saw back in 2007. And as far as capitalization and its relation to the GDP is concerned, I think we will see progress too, because the greater number of companies is going to enter the market, and the share of high-tech companies, IT companies, is going to be greater as compared to the previous wave. As we know, IT companies are more capitalized and they are more evaluated. The valuation is high. So this is but the initial phase of a long wave. There are going to be peaks, there are going to be troughs, downturns, but structurally we are in for a new period of Russian companies that are going to conduct IPOs, that are going to hit the market. So we need to place all of that into the context. And of the last 15 years, we've seen many new deals emerging there in the pipeline, and I think in the several years from now, they will materialize, they will come into practice. To cite a little statistics of the last 12 months, we see 70% what was made of what had been done before in the previous 5 years. Let's have a look at Europe. Yes, the central banks funneled a lot of money into the economy, and 40% of IPO as compared to what happened before in the 5 years before that happened in Europe. So there was a spike in that, and the same is something Russia is in for. There's going to be a spike in the number of IPOs. You mentioned private equity market, and we believe it has to develop, and there are reasons for that, there are grounds. These are not just people who give money for the development of companies, but they also seek to prepare public deals. Private equity investors help companies prepare for that. Elena is one of the biggest players in that field, and they play this role. So the faster the growth of this market, the greater a number of IPOs will get when this new wave that we are witnessing will surge up. And another thing I would like to point out, stimulating investors and traders and issuers by the regulator is a must. I believe that to achieve that, we need some tax-related measures. They would be useful. They could be in the form of tax deductions or tax preferences for IPO funds and for private equity investors. They need to push them towards public placement. And also some measures have to be set forth for those investors that invest into the Russian IPO. We have to have a look at what can be done. This will create a multiplier effect for the Russian economy. This will help both the economy on the whole and individual companies. Yes, thank you. Elena, the floor over to you. Thank you, Yuri. I agree with Alexei to a large extent. This process of a growing number of public companies and the growth of the Russian public market, these processes are natural, and probably it's not that good when it happens too fast, because it might lead, to a pendulum effect. If something happens too fast, the bounce back can be just as quick, just as fast. The thing is, we are working in an economy that has been based on market structures for less than 30 years, and the public market is even younger. In the 90s and in the noughties, the companies were ready for public placement, but those were privatized companies, companies that were in the conventional sectors. Whereas right now we see new companies that were established in the noughties and the 2010s, and they are getting ready to enter the market. So far, just 50% is the ratio to the GDP as compared to 60 to 70% of as compared to the U.S. We shouldn't probably seek the same figures as the U.S., but it is evident that there is a big chunk of our economy, modern companies, technologically developed companies, and these companies are going to grow and they will enter the public market. This is a natural process. And it's good that over the recent years we have seen new impetus, new stimuli emerge for that. We do hope that the system is going to continue to develop. But what do we need for that? First, I would like to underline how important it is that both issuers and both investors understand what it is they're dealing with, because, you know, the public nature of a company is a very specific tool you need to be prepared for. You know, we know examples from history when IPO happen and the placement is successful, but then comes disappointment, either on the part of the owners who got a public company without fully realizing the consequences thereof, nor the expenses, nor the resources they will have to spend inside the money in order to sustain this public status. And very often there is also disappointment on the side of investors, because sometimes, you know, IPO is overestimated, overblown. You buy a beautiful history, and then it turns out that it's no less bright on the inside as it is on the outside. So everyone needs to understand that IPO is but the beginning of a new stage of your public life, and you have to get ready not just for IPO, but for what comes next. Bankers can be of help, but, you know, only at the initial stage. After the IPO, the company finds itself, you know, on its own with investors, with the market, and that is when the disappointment can happen. So, as private equity holders and owners, as consultants, as investment banks, accompanying companies towards IPO, we need to work together, all of us, to make sure that the companies are successful in the longer term. It does not mean that we simply have to maximize the money that we get from the public market. Investors act as our partners, and preferably they have to remain such for many years, and it is very important that this partnership should be mutually beneficial, because that is what makes that interesting both to investors and to us. Investors will wait for another IPO because they see that they've made money out of the previous ones. Moreover, it becomes a very good instrument to attract more money, to attract funds, and then you can use that money for M&A, and you can also, you know, attract other investors, like private equity investors and others. So for me, I believe we have to work together. We've got to act collectively to build this market step by step, and we need our companies, our issues, to be ready for a longer-term partnership with investors. Yes, thank you. Dmitry? Oh, no, Vladimir. I'm sorry, Vladimir. Yes, Yuri, if you'll allow me, I would like to add to what Alexei, to what Elena have said. This is more an opinion, a point of view of the economy. When we are contemplating whether to launch an IPO or not do that, the question of how much it's going to cost comes to the fore. And we also have to do a comparison between an IPO and other types of funding, and very often it boils down to multiplying effects. to where you can place your company. Right now, the multiplying effects in Russia are relatively low as compared to other markets, emerging markets, let alone advanced economies. And there are many factors that explain that. Let me dwell on them a little bit. The lower these multiplying effects, the less attractive an IPO is for investors. So why do we have such a small number of IPOs? Not because we don't have good companies, but simply the demand on the part of investors in our market is not sufficient to ensure a high level of multiplication. There is another reason. We have many foreign investors in the market, and so far Russia's share in their portfolio is relatively small as compared to other markets, which constricts the growth. And any successful IPO in Russia usually, accounts for around 50% of money that comes from abroad, from foreign investors. So we need to work with investors. We have to redirect their attention, their efforts towards Russia. And if we manage to secure that, then the multiplying effect is also going to grow and make the IPO more accessible, more simply better, more attractive. Moreover, it's an issue of volume. Yes, the volume of money funneled into the IPOs. It's growing, but we need to contemplate attracting pension money to that. So far, most of that money is constricted within the debt market. In Russia, this segment of the market is very well developed, and the bond market is also very good, as well as the banking credit market. But the money is still constrained within those bounds, and that is due to the regulation and to the requirements set by the laws. We have other examples like South African money and other markets. There, the money from pension funds can be channeled into IPOs, and money can move more freely, and their market is developing faster. So we have to think about that in Russia too. There is another factor: retail investors, as we can see, access equity markets, leaving behind bonds markets and deposit markets and bonds markets, and they are more active in placing their assets and money in this equity capital. In the past 3 years ago, we had 30,000 retail shareholders. Right now, the figure has increased fivefold, and this trend is going to continue. I would also like to draw your attention to the following fact. We need to focus on developing and training retail investors. Very often they come into the market without fully understanding that they need to plan for a longer term, they need to diversify their investments. And the education should tell people that they shouldn't wait for quick results. They cannot make money quickly. And unfortunately, this is often the case. People need to understand that they need to plan for a longer term, they need to get experience and expertise. Because, if new investors come into the market and right away they get some bad experience, this might have an impact on their subsequent activities. So probably less risky products should first be offered to new investors, to the new arrivals, whereas more complex instruments have to be reserved for more experienced investors. Especially because young investors, new investors usually have fewer assets, but their share is still growing. We see new private investors coming into the market, and if we help train them, then this will help grow this equity market, which in turn will also increase multiplying effects. On a separate note, I do agree with Alexei decreasing the costs of public placement for issues, which can sometimes amount to several percent. If some of this money can be offset through tax deductions, tax preferences, or some subsidies, this could also be a tipping point in making this decision of whether to launch an IPO or not. And this would push forth the market if there are additional reasons that would nudge companies towards conducting IPOs. And the fourth factor, from the point of view of the market itself, we should probably contemplate creating regulatory possibilities for companies with lower levels of capitalization, with high technology companies, because the requirements are very strict. You have to get net profits for several years, and very often technological companies and companies with low capitalization simply do not meet these requirements. And if we want them to develop, if they want them to be able to attract money, if we want to develop our capital market, then we have to think how exactly we can improve regulation for these companies, for them to be able to launch IPOs. Thank you. In other words, to take stock just briefly, intermediately, of the discussion that we've had so far, we kind of cannot say for sure whether the current number of IPO is big or not, because on the one hand, 15 IPOs after a lull is good. On the other hand, if we cite the figures which we used to have in 2007, then we'll see that the potential is still very big. We have to expand the investors network. We have to think about the correct products. We also need to convince our investors to think for a longer term, because Elena has said we are trying to establish a longer-term partnership, and this speculative element has to be brought down to a minimum. The investment potential has to come to the forefront. So developing that kind of cooperation is one of the stimuli, one of the incentives that would attract the right kind of money and expand capital market in Russia. I would also like to highlight that tax preferences and regulatory changes are also of great import in terms of promoting IPOs and raising that number. At the very beginning, both Elena and Alexei have pointed out that if we look at the market, then we will see that we see the arrival of the second wave of IPOs. These businesses were set up a little later, so these are not companies that date back to the Soviet times. No, these are more recent arrivals. And my second question, addressed to Vladimir. Vladimir works at AFP Sistema, and Sistema was working actively with this second wave, and you also put your shares on the stock exchange, and you managed to rear a new cohort of companies that have placed their assets, the shares, in the market. So what is this IPO? Is this public payment? Is it about attracting money for further development, or is it something else? Yes, it is an instrument to attract additional capital. As for what this money is going to be used for, it depends on the strategy of the owner. If IPO seeks to fund investment programs, then you'll see that the number of such IPOs is quite big. Last year we had two such IPOs. Sigaja hit the market at the Moscow Stock Exchange, and its goal was to fund an ambitious development strategy. The company had elaborated. We didn't monetize our share, nor have we sold our share, because we're confident of the company's development. And another IPO was Ozon, and Elena and we participated as key shareholders in this IPO, and the most important goal was to secure capital for the development of the company, and such IPOs are quite widespread.
выход из компании или частичный выход из компании для того, чтобы реализовывать те инвестиционные проекты, которые у него есть в своей собственной воронке развития. И такие IPO также у нас были. Это, как пример, можно привести детский мир, где мы постепенно уменьшили наши доли и сейчас полностью вышли из этого актива. Как правило, здесь собственник выходит не для того, чтобы не для того, что он верит в актив, а может быть даже наоборот верит, а только из-за того, что есть альтернативные инвестиции, в которые ему хотелось бы войти и для которых требуется капитал. Это может быть вторая причина для IPO. Ну и третья, для части собственников может быть это стратегия выхода для того, чтобы диверсифицировать свой портфель, уменьшить свою долю в бизнесе. Это также может быть как обоснованием для экономическим обоснованием для выхода из актива. Поэтому все три направления, они безусловно используются, и мы как компания также, когда принимаем решение в каждом конкретном случае, смотрим, для чего мы это делаем и почему это нам нужно. То есть здесь не может быть какого-то одного ответа, для чего делать. Здесь в каждом конкретном случае в соответствии с стратегией компании нужно решать, нужно IPO, не нужно, и для каких целей, и в какой форме его проводить.
Надеюсь, от вашего ответа они помогут собственникам принять решение и выйти по одной из трех этих причин на биржу.
Мне кажется, главное, чтобы собственники понимали, как это работает, все плюсы и минусы. Безусловно, здесь тоже отмечали стоимость этого мероприятия, оно достаточно недешевое, но те преимущества, которые он дает, они точно нужно учитывать. И поэтому обладание полнотой информации собственнику, оно, безусловно, поможет принять правильное решение в этом. Идти на IPO или не идти.
Спасибо большое. Вот следующий вопрос я бы хотел адресовать сначала Дмитрию, потом Елене. Вот у нас значительная часть недавних размещений российских компаний была структурирована на уровне зарубежных холдингов. Почему так происходит?
Юрий, спасибо за вопрос. Мы действительно сталкиваемся с тем, что компании, IPO которых находятся у нас в работе, недавние сделки, которые произошли на российском рынке, и те компании, с которыми мы только начинаем диалог и помогаем им в осмыслении как раз того, зачем им выходить на публичный рынок и анализу, готовы они или нет выходить в ближайшее время, мы сталкиваемся с тем, что действительно многие компании, головные компании и потенциальные эмитенты являются не российскими компаниями. Какие причины? Ну, во-первых, надо признать, что есть историческая причина, по которой холдинговые компании образовывались за пределами Российской Федерации. Когда-то были довольно значимые налоговые причины для такого структурирования, сейчас налоговых причин стало значительно меньше. Компании, частью бизнеса которых является наличие и использование интеллектуальной собственности и патентов, предпочитали оперировать в зоне международного права, английского права в частности, и хранить эти нематериальные активы
And there's certain inertia we're witnessing when deciding to go public. There's always an option to reorganize, restructure your business and turn it into a Russian company. But that does not always happen. Another reason, which is not the most important one, does not prevail, but at some point we expect that to become obsolete. But currently,
законодательство и правила Московской биржи
under legislation and Russian Stock Exchange rules, companies are allowed to bring international securities on the market. So, a foreign company is allowed to do placement of the same instrument, shares or depository notes on more than one stock exchange, which is a rather attractive opportunity, a better option than what Russian companies have, because the volume that can be traded on stock exchanges restricted by 25%. So this reason is relevant. As far as I understand, debate is underway on maybe lifting those restrictions, but this is where things stand now. Елена? very much agree with Dmitry. I could think of two reasons. First, when a company decides to do an IPO, most cases they're part of a foreign holding. I would disagree as to why that happens. Not because of taxes, because it's really inefficient for a Russian company to have a foreign holding, because of dividends, because of extra costs involved. So it's not about optimizing tax, but rather about legal remedies, legal protection. When we invest in a foreign company, in a private company, where we enter into shareholders agreement with other participants of the company, well, Russian legislation is still developing. It is moving in the right direction, but the level of protection we get on Cyprus under British law is much higher. And it's time-tested, there's court practice, so we find it much more comfortable. So oftentimes when this company that was established as a private entity in Cyprus, in Holland or elsewhere, when it becomes public, that creates additional difficulties in terms of restructuring. So it's past dependency. The situation will be changing, but it probably will be changing slowly, because dealing with shareholders is a serious matter. And second thing we discussed with regulators, which is also important, and this has to do with how companies work and operate after IPOs, is the question of options for staff members. Under Russian law, in the Russian context, it's much more difficult. We're now preparing one Russian company to go public, and we feel like pioneers in a way, since we set up structures to issue options for our staff members in the future. So it's a relevant problem. It has to do with the fact that legal framework does not go back very long. So it is work in progress. We're talking to a regulator. But it's more complicated now than just setting up a legal entity on Cyprus, do a standard stock option plan, and spare yourself the headache. So we need to be moving forward. But let us not forget that we're trying to find money for Russian businesses. So there are alternatives, but I hope there will be less and less need for those alternatives in the future. I would like to add to corporate governance topic what private companies do prior to the IPO is that legislation of foreign countries, including Cyprus and the Netherlands, allows a lot more flexibility when structuring capital. You can issue different classes of shares, you can make simple and convertible instruments, you can limit voting rates, shares with more voting rates, which is important at different stages of companies' lifetime. Russian legislation is evolving. We're looking forward to future developments, but I think a very important factor was creating a toolkit around privileged shares, which is a neglected instrument for Russian companies, because our privatization experience was not very positive. But we understand that those privileged shares are so much easier to structure now, and you can think of options that meet true interests of investors. So that's a new tool that I hope Russian companies will be using more broadly. Dmitry, I would like to now ask to do a poll. Could you put the question on the screen, please?
Я бы хотел, ну, дайте, может быть, я озвучиваю, на какой биржевой площадке следует делать IPO российским компаниям, исключительно в России, исключительно за рубежом,
both Russian and foreign exchange are possible.
Пока будет идти опрос, я бы хотел по этой теме как раз поговорить.
We're doing this poll, I would like to
одну из тем связано
talk about it with you.
Уменьшением,
You just mentioned
увеличением количества депозитарных расписок, которые могут обращаться за рубежом.
growing amount of depository notes that can circulate abroad. It's an important subject that indeed has been discussed. Mr. Shvedov recently suggested to lift restrictions. But if you look at the amounts of Goldman Sachs, VTB Capital, Nestor Bank, I have a question to Alexei and Dmitry. Let's start by talking about foreign companies that do secondary listing. In Russia, would it make sense to do primary listing now that restrictions have been lifted?
Насколько вот если ты делаешь в России с учетом такого вот размещения и возможности
if you do a placement in Russia,
в большом количестве без ограничений,
if you're allowed to issue unlimited number of notes, does that even make sense to do secondary listing abroad? If Alexei doesn't mind, I'm ready to begin answering this question by saying that placement of securities on the Moscow Stock Exchange, irrespective of the type of the deal, has become a golden standard for placement of Russian companies. Central Bank has done a great job, and so has Stock Exchange. It was very much appreciated by investors. It's become much easier to cooperate with Moscow Stock Exchange, and it has become a golden standard, not because banks, organizers, or issuers decided that, but because investors prefer to invest in companies that are listed on Moscow Stock Exchange. Few investors do not have access to the Moscow Stock Exchange out of those that invest in Russia. An exception would be when a placement is done of stocks of high-tech companies, and this is probably the only sector of the Russian economy where we have been able to invite specialized high-tech investors and global investors as well that hold specialized portfolios.
За пределами этой отрасли в акции российских компаний, а может быть даже в акции компаний региона в целом. Это вот то исключение, которое объясняет, почему некоторые российские компании размещаются на американских биржах.
Russian companies do placement abroad. London Stock Exchange has lost its relevance. It used to be the main platform for placement, and most companies we cooperate with these days are either US or Russian Stock Exchange or Russian Stock Exchange only.
Да, спасибо. Ну, я, наверное, сделаю вывод из того, что сказал Дмитрий. В общем-то, если говорить в целом, никакая другая биржа, кроме российской.
Well, to add, I don't think we need any other stock exchange other than Moscow Stock Exchange, because all infrastructure is in place. Over 70% of all Russian liquidity is accounted for by the Russian Stock Exchange. So the overwhelming majority of all blue chips, Russian blue chips, 80 to 90% of their liquidity they're holding on the Russian Stock Exchange. Indeed, there are certain instruments where foreign liquidity amount is still high, but Russian liquidity approaches 50%, which is a very high indicator. If we try to compare Moscow Stock Exchange to any other platform. And that definitely is not an argument towards keeping other platforms. I mean, half of them are in Moscow and the other half might end up in Moscow.
Следующий факт. Есть несколько абсолютно
Also,
блю-чипов, в том числе сама московская биржа,
the number of blue chips, Moscow Stock Exchange itself, Alrosa, Airflood, companies that are only traded in Moscow that have very high liquidity level as compared to the peers that are traded in Europe. Moscow liquidity is much higher than that of many Western platforms. And judging by its market capitalization. From the point of view of high-tech companies, again, I want to give you one recent example. Ozon did it IPO on Nasdaq in Moscow Stock Exchange, and Allegro, which is a Polish company, they did the IPO on the Warsaw Stock Exchange only. So if you look at large holders, shareholders, after the placement, over 70% of shareholders are present in both locations. So the fact that this Polish company is not on Nasdaq, this had no impact whatsoever on demand and on access to key shareholders. And it was a very successful IPO. There's a lot of subscriptions. So one was taking place on the local platform and the other one on Nasdaq. If you look at dozens of transactions in e-commerce over the past 5 years, you'll see that most international companies, not American but international, that operate in this field, over 80% of them did their placements on either domestic or on other international platforms, not on Nasdaq. And in that sense, and colleagues were right to mention that there's certain inertia, there are traditions. Traditions die out hard or evolve hard. But I think we're going in the right direction, and we're likely to very shortly see the companies will do IPOs on Russian Stock Exchange only. And 5 years back, that would be unthinkable. You'd expect such companies to do their IPOs elsewhere. So I think foreign listing is becoming obsolete, a tradition rather than practice. And I think companies need to do placement on Moscow, St. Petersburg Stock Exchange, because this is where the market will be in the next 5 years.
Спасибо большое. Хотелось бы, конечно, сейчас увидеть результаты опроса.
Could we see the results of the poll on the screen?
Если еще минута есть, я хотел бы...
Да, я хотел после этого комментарий ваш получить по этому результату.
And I want to hear your comment. So, what are the... See, it's a tradition. The poll shows that everyone says
параллельно в России и за рубежом, хотя уже ситуация такая, что можно только в России.
Companies should choose both Russian and foreign exchange.
Кстати, отражает реальную картину. Если взять 25 самых ликвидных компаний и посмотреть, то примерно вот 20 имеют только Россию.
20% are listed only in Russia, which corresponds to the results of the poll. Well, work that has been done in recent years. I mean, all the investment in infrastructure that helped bring all investors to Moscow, to the Moscow Stock Exchange. I mean, a lot of effort was done over those years. Now it's finished, and if you look at trading share of non-residents, well, it would be 45%.
Есть большая категория, это российские локальные участники, есть большая категория физических лиц, которые работают. Самое интересное, что второй половине дня, если мы посмотрим долю физических лиц, 60%. Когда уже после начинается вечерняя торговая сессия. Ну вот да, вот это интересные показатели. Сегодня тоже говорили об инвесторах.
And we spoke about investors today. My next question goes to all speakers. So please be very brief.
Это вот состояние российского рынка капитала в значительной степени зависит в целом от
situation on the Russian capital market largely depends.
Во-первых, хотелось бы понять, согласны ли вы с таким утверждением, и как бы вы оценили
how the world sees Russia, how investors see Russia. Would you agree? And
я согласен, что в любом случае.
What do you see happening today? Well, I agree that, of course, attitude towards Russia has an impact.
Получает компании ту способность, которую можно
because that defines companies' abilities to attract capital. I think all in all, well, attitude is not bad, although could be improved. But the fact that public placements that our company has been doing and the response of foreign investors shows that there is stable demand and we don't see problems in placement, although, of course, things could be improved. Judging by our recent transactions, current transactions, we see that foreign investors are very pragmatic. At any point in time, on any market, for any new company, they try to balance risks and potential earnings. Most Russian companies that are entering the market have found good balance. The structure of growth is definitely switching towards Russian institutional investors, but we see investors from the US, Great Britain, continental Europe, and Asia. They're interested, and this interest is getting stronger. Let me rephrase what Dmitry said. Investors are outside politics. They don't want to be political. They're not into geopolitics. Geopolitical situation does influence the market, but I can think of three really big cases: 1998, 2008, 2014. Otherwise, if it's a Russian company that operates domestically, if it's high-tech, for instance, the market is generally very positive. It's a large market that can offer good quality technology. So if it's a healthy growth, if it's a healthy company, investors appreciate Russia. If we don't start talking geopolitics, because otherwise, of course, it gets way more negative. So, hopefully, more and more often our strong businesses will be considered irrespective of where they're based. Let me just give you one example to show how constructive investors are towards Russian companies. We have many companies that are Russian champions or international champions, both in natural resources, high-tech, consumer sectors, that are traded without any discount and compete with companies that have the largest multipliers. And I think it speaks volumes. Good quality Russian companies with good prospects and professional managers, they're appreciated by investors. Thank you. We have more questions from the audience. Next question.
Календамила задает вопрос следующий. Что вы можете посоветовать собственнику бизнеса, который хочет выйти на рынок капитала?
When is a good moment?
Наверное, если очень кратко, должно совпасть несколько важных факторов. Первое. Компания должна быть достаточного размера для того, чтобы иметь возможность предложить инвесторам значимую ликвидность, то есть размер сделки. Компания должна иметь политики,
Companies' policies, processes and accounting should be in line with the requirements of both Moscow Stock Exchange and international disclosure requirements. So these are two main factors, I'd say. And third, you need to look at the situation on the market, volatility, macroeconomic situation. Market should be open, investors should be ready to invest. Oh, and I would add that as to figures, the size of IPO matters. Company should cost at least $1 billion, better $2 billion. And second, if you want to attract large foreign investors, the amount of placement should be $500 to $800 million. $800 million is better to be able to attract larger funds in placement. Otherwise, when placement, a small amount of liquidity becomes limited after the placement on stock exchange, and then large foundations will not enter the placement. And that would result in significant discount which is bad. So to sum up, let me just say two words. Moscow Stock Exchange, we talked about it. Moscow is ready to make a placement, not only in Moscow, but regulatory change of legal framework is needed. Already, we see that 18% of our audience think that placement can be done on the Moscow Stock Exchange only. Very likely we shall see second-tier companies that will make the placement, that have grown their businesses in recent years, that have achieved certain volume, and that would be prepared to do an IPO. So we anticipate about 10 placements, IPOs and SPOs this year, dozens of IPOs in the next years. So hopefully change in legal framework will be instrumental. Unfortunately, we did not have much time. Time flew. Thank you for this interesting discussion, colleagues.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants and viewers of the International Financial Congress. I am glad to welcome you at this session entitled Green Finance for Green Growth. We're going to talk to our distinguished speakers about this issue. First, we have Elena Kuritsina with us, Director of the Corporate Relations Department, Bank of Russia. Portfolio Advisor of East Capital, David Nichols. Ekaterina Trofimova, partner, head of financial institution services in Russia and the CIS Deloitte, and also Denis Shulakov, first vice president of Gazprom Bank. Speaking about green growth and environmental agenda, we refer first and foremost to the issue of climate change, which is becoming a threat. Increasingly, last year became the second hottest year on record, probably even the hottest one, together with 2016. It all depends on the methodology for calculating the average temperatures, but it turns out that the two hottest years fall on the 21st century, and this is due to man-made activities, especially if we compare that to pre-industrial era. Right now, the goal is to prevent the temperature from growing above 2 degrees centigrade, because as the World Meteorological Organization says, that's very dangerous, but locally this threshold can be broken, and there is a 20% chance of that in several places of the world. Yes, there are extreme weather phenomena, temperature records, and other problems, and climate change also brings with it a warming of the world ocean, melting of glaciers. There is a risk of inundation and also forced migration of people, and the temperature is becoming increasingly volatile. It can have different impact on different regions. There are different calculations. Some believe that several places will benefit from the global warming, but mostly, on average, the world is going to lose. And the IMF estimates that should the surface continue to become hotter by 0.04 degrees, then it will have a terrible impact on the world GDP. It's going to decrease by 7% by 2100. If we manage to slow it down, then the impact on the world GDP is going to be up to just 1%. But before we move on to a more detailed discussion about green finance instruments, I would like to ask all speakers to just briefly share your view with us. Do you think the financial market is capable of making a huge contribution right now to the fight against global warming? Elena, let's start with you. Yes, Ekaterina, thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. I would like to say unequivocally, yes, it can do that. But, you know, it's not about whether it's yes or no. It's yes because there is no alternative, there is no other choice. Experts differ in their view as to how much money is going to be required to achieve this energy green transition. The estimates differ, but, you know, it's to the tune of hundreds of billions of rubles, and national budgets are not going to be able to achieve that without attracting the resources of the market. David? Yes, absolutely yes. There are different leverages, different levers, but from the point of view of investors, we believe that the most important thing is engagement. We've got to talk to companies. We've got to clearly communicate to them our expectations. You know, we have BP, Exxon, Glencoe, other Western companies that have achieved a lot, but Russian companies also listen to investors, and they have already managed to make a lot of headway in that regard. Yes, I think it's an unambiguous yes. We're all unanimous in that regard. We believe banks are already playing, and they will continue to play, an important role in this economic transformation. As has been aptly said, these changes will require colossal investment, the banks won't be able to stand aside. But for banks too, this is yet another opportunity to revisit how they see their business, how they can manage risks. According to Deloitte calculations and studies, in the next 3 years, Russian banks think that in 40% of cases, climate change will have a direct bearing on their financial outcomes. So it is also about, financial stimulation of what they're doing. Yes, thank you. And Dennis, I have to join everyone who has spoken before me, but I'd like to highlight 2 points. First, financial markets represent the biggest source of investment. And there is another aspect to financial markets, what Ekaterina has drawn our attention to. It's about syndicating your risks. Right now, companies, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes they are forced to do that, but they accept sustainable development principles. They improve and revisit the strategies for development, and if they do that, then the market will show that they're going to be more competitive. Yes, I'm very glad to see this unanimity. Right now, I would like to ask our audience, when you think about investing your own money, your own assets, what is the most important consideration? Are you willing to forego high profitability, knowing full well that you make a contribution to your future? This is the question we would like to ask you. Yes, no, I won't forego profitability. Yes, if the profitability is around 5%. Yes, if we lose just 1 percentage point, and the last is yes, because that's more important than the figures. It's not about the figures. So no, yes, from 0.1 to 0.5. From 0.5 to 1, and it's not about the figures. Elena, I'd like to ask you the following. Right now, many economies are redirecting money into greening the economy. The banks cannot stop the climate change because they do not have the necessary toolkits, but as financial institutions, they can mobilize the efforts that are required and resources that are required to transition to a low-carbon economy. So what are Russian banks already doing in that regard? Yes, the regulators, of course. Thank you very much for this question. I believe the Bank of Russia is one of the first government authorities that has started to look very closely at the climate agenda back in 2013. We understood that there probably would exist a need to introduce green social instruments into the financial sphere, and we had the arrival of first instruments in 2020, and in 2022 we published recommendations for social investors, the recommendations of responsible investment. I believe David knows about that, everything, and he'll probably share with us more details afterwards. As the regulator for the financial market, the Bank of Russia, if we look at what we can do to improve funding for sustainable development, well, in that sense, the Bank of Russia focuses on instruments, on financial instruments. As I said, green bonds and social bonds started to be issued in 2020, and we see that this segment is growing. In 2020, this segment grew several times as compared to previous year. And right now, we have seen already 13 batches of such bonds on the Moscow Stock Exchange. But of course, if we compare us to the Western experience, we will see that there is still a lot of room to grow. We still have a long way to go because, the figures in the West are incomparable to what we have in Russia, according to CBI. To cite an example, that's the climate bond initiative. As of the end of 2020, that was $1.1 trillion US. And by June 2021, the figures have risen to $1.3 trillion US, and these are just the green bonds. And if you take the overall investment into sustainability, then it's going to rise to the amount of more than $2 trillion US. If we try to come to grasp, to grips with these figures, we see it's enormous capital, and as you can see, the financial market is already playing an important role in funding the climate and the energy transition. Definitely, as far as Russia is concerned, we still have a long way to go. We've got to push forward. I have to tell you that we are going to experience more difficulties than European countries due to the simple reason that we see lower demand for sustainable tools, for sustainable business on the part of investors, both institutional investors and household investors. So far, Russia does not have this conscientious demand created by the population for investment, for responsible investment, for responsible behavior. We will have to work on that so that investors come to realize how important that is, so that investors, in responding to the question that you've put on the screen, would say that it's not about the figures, it's about how our children and grandchildren will live 50 or 100 years hence. The Bank of Russia takes part in developing the regulation for these instruments. Recently, we have published the amendments to the rules for issuing green and social bonds. Given the forthcoming changes, given the national taxonomy of green and social projects that is going to be introduced, given the forthcoming implementation of national identification system, we believe it is possible to liberalize to a certain extent the issuance of green bonds. These bonds could be easier to issue, they could become more accessible too, and we are hopeful that by the end of summer we will be able to adopt these amendments. And we also want these regulations to fit with the regulations that the Ministry of Economic Development and the VEB have come up with. I refer to the documents on the green taxonomy in particular. There is another avenue we are pursuing, trying to stimulate new instruments. We are also working on a green mortgage. We believe it's an important avenue to be pursued. We can see that there is huge potential we can tap there, and it's also of great significance to our population because it does not simply boil down to finance. It is about the health of people who live in where they live. It's about their quality of life, quality of their sleep, and other health-related aspects. So, together with the Ministry of Construction, we asked the Ministry to set up a working group that would set forth the standards for green construction, green buildings. We cannot talk about green mortgage until we have introduced a certain level of regulation with regard to what should be qualified as green construction and what shouldn't. And the third, most importantly, the issue of stimulation, the issue of how exactly the government is going to support the development of this market. On many occasions, we have said that so far we are not willing to talk about any specific measures of prudential stimulation. But, of course, Russia has signed the Paris Agreement, so Russia has committed itself to stimulate the redirection of capital flows into funding sustainable development. So, accordingly, Russia has to come up with a way of stimulating the issuance of such tools. We have drafted a number of proposals which we submitted to the Ministry for Economic Development. We believe we could focus on tax-related measures, as we have seen tax preferences for bonds placement have had a significant impact on the growth of this market. Unfortunately, these measures have already been phased out, but we believe that if we reintroduce them, they could support the nascent market of green and social bonds. Of course, there can be other instruments such as subsidies and coupons, on bonds, and also on verification. Verification can be very pricey, and we intend to discuss our proposals during the next session of the working group under the direction of the Ministry for Economic Development. When can these stimulation measures be introduced? For them to be implemented, we will need a decision by the government, and if these are going to be tax-related measures, then we need to have amendments to the tax code, and it's going to be a lengthy process. You know, when we hear about the colossal sums that are already being invested into green projects, I always think, how do we make sure that the money is used for the right purposes, and how do we distinguish between good purposes and bad ones? That is a very apt question. In order to understand what is good and what's not a good purpose, for that, and we create this green taxonomy. Until recently, both we and our issuers were using European approaches when designating green projects or socially sustainable projects. As previously mentioned, the Ministry for Economic Development has been working together with WRF, and it has come up with the draft national green taxonomy and a national taxonomy of green projects. We expect these documents to be endorsed by the government in the near future, which will launch this system at the national level. It is encouraging that our national taxonomy is in full compliance with the European taxonomy. It's different just in one part, you know, because it's country-specific. We believe that nuclear power projects fall within the green category, whereas the European countries are still engaged in a discussion, and so far they do not include nuclear power projects into the green category. So another thing, in order to understand where the money is being distributed and channeled, we have established a national global system, the verification system, that authenticates that the actions of the issuer meet the promises, that indeed the money the issuer has got through placing these green bonds are going to be used for green projects. And this verification system is going to be upscaled. So those verification institutions are third parties. They're not government agents. No, not the government. These can be auditors, or these can be consulting agencies that specialize in verification in environment, sustainable development. And they are genuinely independent. Their role is very close to that of an auditor, but the auditor verifies your financial reporting, whereas these verificators authenticate that truly the money has been used for the purposes promised by the issuer when the bonds were issued. So you can see where the money has been invested. And do you understand what is going to happen to those who do not fulfill their promises and invest in other sources? Yes, there are instruments for that. If an issuer has issued green bonds promising to channel them, and then, you know, the verification process has taken place, then the project prepared by the ministry and VEB, you know, this document stipulates that verification has to happen once a year or more often, depending on the terms of the issuance, and then it turns out that the money has been used to buy a yacht, for instance, or for other pleasant things, then the consequences ensue. And these green bonds are no longer considered as green. They are excluded from all government support measures. Moreover, we will require that this issuer is excluded from the prospectus of green bonds issuance. They should be excluded from the relevant registry at the Moscow Stock Exchange. And the documents on the issuance also have to contain some sanctions with regard to the bonds themselves, either, you know, payback before the deadline, We are still talking about that, and we believe that the issuer can set these terms on its own. It can be a raise in the coupon rate or other penalties that have to be included into the prospectus. Yes, thank you. Next, I would like to speak in greater detail about the Russian banks. As far as I understand, they have set the goal of greening their portfolios. They provide us with a range of green products. Recently, there was a study on how far ESG factors are taken into account by the banks. Ekaterina, could you please tell us what the outcomes are of this study? Is the Russian banking sector ready to serve as a catalyst for mobilizing the resources with a view to achieving an energy climate transition? Yes, thank you very much for taking note of this study. We did it at the request of the Association of Russian Banks. The association initiated this study, and, you know, it was a very good thing from the point of view of Deloitte, because we are a global consultancy on ESG principles. We see that the Russian banks arrived here in this field with a certain lag, but right now the growth is explosive. Elena has cited some statistics, but let me share with you some Russian figures. If we look at the years ahead, then we will see an explosive growth of ESG assets, not just green assets. This will be accompanied by a greater regulatory interest, also by an increase in stimulation programs. There are going to be behavioral changes, and also the market is going to be increasingly interested in that. As Elena has said, we see a generational shift happening, and the expectations of consumers are shifting too. We feel that in retail. It's obvious. And, you know, just shortly, on a separate note, I would like to say that usually the banks are the agents of everything new, interesting that comes from the Western markets. And interestingly, in this particular case, banks have been acting with a certain lag as compared to export-oriented companies. Banks have arrived late to this field of ESG principles, but still, be that as it may, it's important. So far, understanding is not that well developed. We do, however, have the requisite infrastructure, as Elena has said, for the development of ESG instruments, ESG loans, ESG policies, but so far we do not have a comprehensive government framework for that. We do not have a taxonomy. These elements are only now emerging, nor do we have a system for economic stimulation, so it's going to be very interesting to know what the answer is going to be to the question that you posed to the audience. You know, when we prepared this study, we ran into doubts as to economic feasibility of this development, and these questions remain. As of now, our Deloitte study demonstrates that only around 10% of Russian banks, and we have studied all Russian banks that existed back then. You know, it was spring and early summer this year. We studied the banks that had licenses, and only 10% to an extent, just in some aspects, adopted ESG practices, or only 40% used the practices of corporate social responsibility. So, to be blunt, right now, greening and ESG principles, this is usually what big companies are working on. And in our study, we pointed out that this is probably one of the factors that will have a bearing on the competitive environment. Given the complex nature of these processes, given the requisite transformations in operational management and risk management, which will require additional investment. Given all that, we see that the gap might grow between the most advanced banks and other banks across the system. And on the whole, based on Deloitte experience, not just in Russia, but elsewhere too, first and foremost in other countries where this process is ahead of ours. So based on this experience, we see that the ESG transformation regime is playing an increasingly important role in assessing risks and in shaping markets. Interestingly, usually there are some classic factors that affect investors' price parameters for borrowing, and these are the assessments of credit risks.
Since mild loan situation in the world continues and low default rate persists, ESG loans become more attractive in terms of borrowing parameters on markets, and it is not impossible that if we continue living in this very mild situation, they will become even more relevant. So even in annual reports of many global organizations, we see that ESG disclosure factors come to the forefront, and we see lots of perspectives for that as well. This research has shown that less than 1% of Russian banks disclose any information about their ESG work. So that speaks for itself. We see that a lot is to be done. Under 20% of banks understand what ESG is, what green means. And most importantly, and it's a question to our colleagues, what do investors expect to see as they try to understand what ESG is and what to do about it? Nonetheless, we see growing interest towards the subject. It's underpinned by action. 15% of Russian banks note that they see demand on behalf of clients, on behalf of the market, demand for the development of ESG. Also, they note that over 30% in the 3-year period will be able to introduce ESG practices in their work. Banks are facing many challenges. To mention but one, lack of qualified experts. We don't have enough qualified people that would understand, not just understand in theory, but be able to apply in practice these principles. So we see the emergence of the market. And if there are young experts watching, life hack to you, this is a very interesting and also a very promising line of work where you could grow professionally, and there'll be more and more demand for such experts on the labor market. A few more words about potential. Until the year 2036, should existing trends persist, according to our estimate, ESG assets might exceed 360 trillion rubles. And by the year 2030, green loans, sustainable development-related goals might exceed 1.3 trillion rubles. So we're talking about a lot of money. We're getting questions from the audience. One has to do with green mortgage that Yelena mentioned and green deposits. Did you assess their prospects? Well, we think they're good prospects. These instruments are indeed developing very rapidly. But again, I don't want to give any specific price-related parameters on specific instruments, because objectively everything depends not just on consumer interest or bank interests, but it will very much depend on how regulators see risks. So it's a joint exercise of looking at the situation from all angles and trying to find good balance between risks and opportunities. So I want to note, the forecast I gave in terms of figures is rather long-term, because I think that this fine-tuning, which we're still going through, might be subject to trial and error. Yelena mentioned greenwashing, where you pretend that certain instruments are green, but they're not. Unfortunately, we've seen a number of such unfortunate examples, and likely we will see more of them in the future. But it's important to give this process a good start. This is what we're focusing on. I have a question to Dennis. It has been said that we've seen 13 issues of green bonds on the Moscow Stock Exchange. Are Russian companies interested in this instrument? And take into account what Ekaterina just mentioned. I mean, the situation with banks remains difficult, so what should be done in terms of regulation or interaction with Russian companies to achieve explosive growth of such green instruments on the Russian market, like what we see globally? I prepared a little slide
оценить то, что сказали в позитивную сторону, и мне кажется, выступление Екатерины было не негативное. Оно было как раз очень позитивное,
colleagues, and I think Ekaterina was very positive in her statement. So she said that the market
смотрит это как на окно возможностей, чем как на бегство от неудач.
This is a window of opportunity, not trying to escape from failure, but let us be realistic. Last year, ESG market grew by 231%. In the first half of this year, it grew by 84% as compared to previous year. In absolute figures, it doesn't look that impressive. I agree. We've seen 13 issues of green bonds, 4 issuance of social bonds. But this is not all the risk, because we're not taking into consideration 100 billion that we issued by Russian railroads, because back then they did not meet certain norms to be able to classify them under sustainable development, but they were very much in line with ICMA standards. So by international standards, they were green bonds. And also we're not taking into consideration Eurobonds. And a number of issues took place, and today local market is showing more progress than Russian companies entering foreign markets. If we look at Russian bonds, we'll see that Russian market accounts for 61% as opposed to 39% if we look at the volume of green bonds on the international market. And we need these statistics, although it's not as entertaining, but we needed to understand the phenomena. You mentioned interest, but if a company is set up, if it's not a charity foundation, it's set up to derive profit. And for that, it's either maximizing its financial results by raising volume of sales or by cutting costs. When a company seeks funding, it either is looking for the cheapest money there is on the market or is selling its risks at the lowest possible rate. So it's a two-sided task. So today when we talk about sustainable development and capital market, sustainable development related requirements have become rather stable. So it is a window of opportunity, like I said, but we can look at it differently. With happy people, meaning people that work in this field, because this is something completely new. Let's look at countries that have set forth those targets. China decided to achieve net zero by 2060, and according to them that would cost 16 trillion. Europe said that by the year 2050 individual countries will achieve similar results, but at 3 to 4 trillion. But probably they're limiting timelines not to speed up inflation, but the Global Association of Capital made their calculations and saw that if we want to achieve net zero by 2050, 123 trillion is needed. I mean, we've never seen such calculations. We've never seen such windows of opportunity. And we're saying it is a great opportunity because in order to be able to switch to this economy, hydrogen economy, we need 3 times more electricity. Well, our president made a joke that you don't get electricity from the wall where your socket is. You need to produce this electricity. And this means we're likely to see explosive growth of fossil, hydro, and nuclear energy, although we need to reduce the share of fossil fuels, but still we need them at this point of time. So the big question is, how is that going to be funding? And sustainable, responsible funding becomes important. You will not get funding unless you meet all the criteria. You're asking whether Russian companies are interested. Well, COVID made people as they were. In lockdown, made people think of what is it they do in life. We assess many of things in life. I just had COVID, and I can tell that as you get better, you think of all the positive things that keep you together. And so did the society. And Russian companies are no exception. They are equal participants of international markets, and we will have to take on board all these principles. Look at what the market did. It's on the left. We saw that in 12 months, there were a number of principles that were developed and integrated, and 2 standards were introduced, green bonds and social bonds. But the world does not stand still. Not all companies can be green. I mentioned extraction of natural resources. What are we to do now is to stop extracting in Siberia, and cities will be abandoned. Canada, France have similar problems. We're not alone in that sense. So people thought about it and came up with a different standard, saying, okay, green economy is where we're heading. But along the way, we need to make sure we don't lose faith. So we need to find a standard that would help us go through the transition. Sustainability-linked bonds constitute such standards that are based on KPIs related to this transition. The standard has not been introduced in Russia, but like Elena said, Central Bank is closely looking into it, and we're working on introducing the standard in Russia, and then 95% of our economy will be involved in sustainable finance projects. Last year we introduced 2 new standards. If this year we're able to introduce those SLB bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and if we introduce sustainability criteria for a combination of sustainable and green products, and also transition bonds,
не в ответ на критику, а на предупреждение потенциального
that were created in order to prevent the situation where a company that has a large carbon footprint but wants to go green, I mean, that was banned. A company that is not green should not be allowed to issue green bonds, even for the separate green products. So a new standard was introduced, which has become institutionalized, and I'm sure that this standard will also be integrated in the Russian legal framework. And there's no alternative, because if we look at the lowest graph on the right, lowest diagram on the right, you'll see that this is a unique opportunity that comes from investor side. Investors that subscribe to sustainable financing principles. It's over 3,000 investors. Over 450 of them invest in Russia, so they're all on this list. As of July last year, half of assets managed by those investors should be placed in instruments that were created, taking on board ESG factors. And as of next year, the rumor has it requirements will go up to 90%. So if we make an aggregate, we'll say that the total money managed is 110 billion. So if we split it, if we check which part is accounted for by bonds, we'll see that amount of underinvestment is 8 to 10 trillion, and the requirement is 50 trillion. So we've never lived in a world where that much money would be looking to be invested in such instruments, and they can be nominated in domestic currencies. So we need to think of how we can get prepared to meet this change. Most important thing we need to do is to level or equal tax regulations for non-residents, that is foreign investors, who could invest in Russian corporate bonds like they do in Eurobonds. You say it goes without saying, but it's not a given, no. Today, Russian investors, as they invest on the local Russian market, they have to pay higher taxes. So if we're able to deal with that, then we will welcome this global money on our market. This would be the largest resource we could use at this point of time. And this will add life to the economy and will make this transition possible for us. What else needs to be done? So we need to integrate new instruments in our legal framework. We need to make them more liquid, such as repo, mostly repo through central counterparty, and we have infrastructure in place. And we need companies that, some say we need companies that should be enthusiasts, front runners, but I don't think we really do. I think at some point, as people understand the situation, more and more of them will be ready to make a step. We've started this dialogue with over 60 Russian companies. We're currently working on 3 mandates. Look at Rosatom deal. The number 13 that under the sustainable development, it happened on the Russian market and was welcomed by the Russian market. We cannot say there's greenium on the Russian market where bond price would go down because it's by 5–10% just because it's green. But I can tell you that market has shown a lot of interest and the spread was very low.
Это 67 базисных пунктов. Вот вам результат. Спасибо.
I have to interrupt because we're running out of time. Maybe, Lena, you would like to comment? I can just reaffirm very quickly that there's a lot of interest towards transition SLB products, and we, together with the Bank of Russia and market participants, are working on it, and hopefully by the end of the year would be able to implement those standards in the legal framework. And now I would like to ask to bring on the screen answers to our polls, and it's really interesting how people voted. The question was, what matters more when we decide on investment? 28% are ready to lose yield because it's important, and only 12% are not ready to lose yield. I think it's a very good split. So, David, you as someone who is responsible for investment, since it's already become a tradition abroad using those sustainable financial instruments, would you really lose yield? And as foundations that try to increase share of green instruments in their portfolio, how do they strike balance between responsibility in front of their clients and in front of their clients, and clients care about yield, as you know. Well, we are from Sweden, and most of our clients have withdrawn from oil and gas sectors. Like I said, we really believe that if you want to achieve good results, engagement is very important. You need to convey your message across. And our clients understand and appreciate this approach. At the same time, they're smart people and they understand that ESG, climate change, is not just something we do for the sake of future generations, or in order to, look good, tick boxes, or make beautiful presentations. I think this change will have very significant impact on the cost of Russian companies, not in 10 years, but right now. In worst-case scenario, assessment of Russian companies, unless they apply those new practices, might drop by 50%. So I wouldn't say that yield should necessarily go down. And even if it does a little, it also helps reduce risks, which is very important for us and for all of our clients, especially since they're sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. They think long-term. And I want to add a tactical aspect that was mentioned. $50 trillion that have to be invested or need to be invested in ESG type securities. So if companies have ESG strategies, if they have good matrix, I think they will get better multipliers when trading as compared to other companies that do not have ESG strategy, that have bad matrices. So, no, I don't think it's a problem. Well, it's good thing that hopefully in the near future we will not have to make a difficult choice that our audience had to make. East Capital is an international foundation that invested in Russia and still investing in Russia. And you stayed through the difficult recent years. So do you think financial instruments could become a driver that would encourage other international foundations turn towards Russia? Yes, of course. Maybe not immediately, though. There are two things to keep in mind. If we look at regular instruments, such as equity, fixed income, and regular companies, I think metallurgy looks very interesting. We can argue a lot about oil and gas, about role of oil and gas companies, but demand for metals is huge, and it is needed for transition. So I strongly advise IEA Net Zero scenario, which is an interesting publication, but demand for metals is really promising. Look at nickel. Now it's in 10 years the growth will grow 18-fold to 50-something billion. So we are looking for long-term structural opportunities, and so do other funds. So I think metallurgy offers great opportunities. But we know that these are active companies, so I think we'll get there. Thank you, David. We're still getting questions from the audience, from our virtual audience. So, could you very briefly list the advantages of green bonds, both for investors and for issuers? Well, for an investor, I can tell we promise our clients that we're going to be taking ESG principles into consideration, and if we fail to do so, will have difficulty. But for companies, there are also strong advantages because that changes culture of companies. It makes companies more conscious. And it's not just about ticking the box, because it really will, in the long term, make companies more successful. And the question to Yelena, when will the Bank of Russia publish recommendations on disclosure on non-financial accounting? Within the next 2 or 3 weeks max. We've done a lot of work with the market, and we're now finalizing this text with our lawyers. So apparently people are looking forward. And a question related to people that will be authenticating, talking about greenwashing. As far as I know, currently there are no requirements, and anyone can do verification. Indeed, it is the case. Right now, draft regulations that were produced by Weberov, that is being considered by government, are very liberal in terms of who can act as verificator, but WebRF will be a self-regulatory organization in a sense. It will execute certain control and supervision over what verificators do and how they operate, and if they see that someone does not meet the high standards, they would be able to stop this company from verifying further projects, but we understand it's just a first step, and if we see that this system needs to be fine-tuned and developed, it's not impossible that at some point we not as central bank, but as Russian Federation, we might switch towards regulation and public control and supervision. So we've run out of time. Just want to thank our speakers for being with us for their very interesting presentations. And thank all the audience and wish you all the best. Thank you.